So the Bantu migration never happened, but what happened was a Zanj Moorish invasion, migration, destabilization, and gold fleecing of the gold-rich kingdoms of Africa between 600 and 1500 CE, before further destabilization and another gold fleecing by imperial European countries from 1500 CE onwards. The adoption of this inaccurate Bantu migration theory has been a result of ignoring African history before European imperialism. This history explains the origins and conditions that led to the formation of many of the modern ethnic groups in Africa today. Many that didn't exist before 900 CE and did not occupy the territories they currently do. Africa has a history before the late 1400s or Portuguese impression, and this video will cover a small part of it to explain why the Bantu migration never happened, but the Zanj and Moorish invasions did. To understand why the Bantu migration didn't happen, we have to start with the beginning of the fall of Aksum, which happened between 600 and 700 CE. So let's go to Aksum. The Kingdom of Aksum rose on the heels of the decline of Russia, or Kush. It was located in modern-day North Ethiopia and Eritrea. Cosmas, who traveled to India, that was his name translated to English, was a Greek writer who wrote about Aksum in 550 CE, right before it fell. On Aksum, Cosmas wrote that it was a devout Christian kingdom when he visited. The kingdom was ruled by the king Caleb, or Ella Asbeha, I hope I said his name correctly, who was a devout Christian king and dedicated to spreading Christianity. So we can say Christianity was in Africa way before the Europeans or Islam ever were. This king was also, quote, a great friend of the Romans, and maintained friendly relations with the Byzantine Empire, other Christian states, and Africa, with whom the kingdom carried out trade, so Aksum was like a middleman between the north and the south. Writings say his country was also abundant in gold. So at this point, Aksum controlled the ancient gold mines of Russia, or Kush as people call it. By the 600s, Aksum began to lose its control of the gold mines and influence. These 100 years between 600 and 700 CE saw the rise of Islam, which by 642 CE had completely conquered Egypt, so the north of Africa was now under expanding Islamic caliphates. The king of Aksum may have unintentionally contributed to this expansion and the fall of his own kingdom by protecting Islamic refugees in 615 CE, who were fleeing death sentences from their tribe in Mecca. They won his favor because they basically read out of the chapter of Mary, showing they knew Jesus. They knew to do this because Aksum had a Christian bias and favored anyone that showed an inclination towards Christianity. This targeting was often not violent, but entrenchment from within, which is what happened to Aksum and other African kingdoms. Over time, the Muslim or Islamic influence grew within Aksum, and they used Aksum as a base to regroup and stage the invasion of Egypt to the north, so that by 639 CE, they had staged a first conquest, and by 643 CE had conquered Alexandria and taken full control of Egypt. By the 700s, the Islamists had established their first sultanate in Africa. That covered the area of Tunisia, part of Algeria, and Libya, and they were looking for free labor and military service bodies. So the people initially worst affected by this Islamic expansion were the Nilo-Saharan, who were in close proximity because they inhabited the region of modern-day Sudan, South Sudan, Niger, Chad, Central Africa, and northeastern parts of Africa as well. Others initially affected were the native ancient Egyptians and the Greek and Roman descended people who hadn't converted or fled into the protection of Aksum or the Byzantine Empire. These people were often targeted and abducted in the Islamic-led human abduction raids for the caliphates, because these caliphates were first expanding west across the Sahara in Africa, with the earliest sultanate in Africa being established in the 700s in what is now Tunisia, and the next one in what is now Senegal in the 800s. It wasn't until the Sultanate of Mogadishu in the late 800s, early 900s that Islam expanded into Proto-Bantu territory. Mogadishu, before the Nilo-Saharan population occupied it, was part of the Great Lakes Proto-Bantu territory. The term Mogadishu is from a Bantu expression. It was spelled Mogadishu. And there are other places in that territory that still had their Proto-Bantu names in the 1800s. And we will get to how it got that way. It wasn't until the late 800s or 9th century that Islamic influence broke into the ancient Proto-Bantu territory at Mogadishu, which means within the life force of the great wind. And by this point, the Zanj rebellion had started in 869 CE and was in full swing. And these people, who were initially taken from the Nilo-Saharan populations, were looking for land and resources, and with a little bit of Stockholm syndrome, but for what was familiar to them, which were the caliphates. The idea that the Zanj were mostly Bantu isn't accurate, because the regions worst affected by and that had come under Islamic influence between 643 and 900 CE were not Proto-Bantu regions, but Nilo-Saharan, Kushite, Aksumite, Senegal, and Tunisia. So it is important that African history stops defaulting to Bantu for everything. We clearly weren't in the Sahara or West Africa during the initial Islamic expansion, the same way the San people are found nowhere near any of this business. This Islamic expansion picked up momentum as Aksum, which was initially a buffer between the Proto-Bantu and Islamic expansion, weakened. As Aksum continued to weaken, it fractured, which saw the rise of splinter groups with competing interests. Some of these groups allied with the Islamic raiders, the Zanj, and became puppets to protect themselves from enslavement, which targeted non-Islamic people, and these became sultanates. It is important to note that only those individuals adjacent through relation to the caliphate could become a sultan. So a lot of these fresh African converts could not, unless they married into it for the men. So in order to obtain favor, they continued to work for the sultan by abducting their neighbors into slavery. I hate this part of history. So the sultanates needed resources to hold their power, which was really only validated by their claim to a relation to their prophet. So they sought to control gold in Africa south of the Sahara, which was still under Proto-Bantu control. In addition to the internal destabilization from the various sects, resulting in violent conflict which needed warriors and young women to birth these enslaved babies to repopulate their new populations. They proceeded to abduct Africans who were not under the protection of a strong kingdom or military. So it stands to reason that the initial abductions started in the first two sultanates, or the areas adjacent to Tunisia and Senegal, which had West African, Nilo-Saharan, Kushite, Aksumite, and Central African populations. These abductions and the confusion that ensued created an ebb and flow effect among the populations in these regions. As they were abducted, they often broke away, joined other populations seeking refuge, got abducted again, stayed with their abductors, until the next generation probably broke away again. So it was a constant remaking of ethnic group and language. This is how Africa began to see a rise in ethnic groups and many people speaking similar languages or dialects. At this point, 900 CE, Aksum was now a shell of its former self, concentrated to the Ethiopian highlands as the Zangwe dynasty, which continued the traditions of Aksum. As Aksum fell, Islamic conquest and reconstructed groups spread unchecked into Africa south and east of the Sahara around 900 CE. This was the ancient Proto-Bantu kingdom. This kingdom had a policy of resettling refuge seekers who promised to be peaceful, just like the Hyksos were settled. This kingdom had an unconventional structure, which deserves a video of its own. But the basic idea is that the kingdom had two kingdoms within it. One was the Wapati or elder kingdom, and the other was the Ghana or younger kingdom. Both were autonomous, and within them had Nyiga. The terms Manyiga or Tanganyika come from this expression. These were districts that were autonomously governed by a lady or lord of a clan. It was the responsibility of the district's lady or lord to uphold the relationship to the great house. And this is where a lot of people got lost. The great house doesn't seek subjects or tribute like other kingdoms. It has a role that is known to the members. It is like a ship that lives when called. The members do not know when that will happen, but they just know to be on it when it does. I will cover this in a spirituality video, but the great house doesn't micromanage anyone. It just ghosts people. So whenever refuge-seeking groups arrived, they were at the discretion of the district lady or lord on whose land they are perched. Now the great house doesn't take in refuge seekers by policy, and the districts aren't technically supposed to, but some of them do, and the consequences are theirs to bear. Which is what happened and broke the ancient Proto-Bantu kingdom's districts apart. Because during this time, a lot of the refuge seekers weren't exactly good guests. They entrenched and usurped from within, often taking control of the resources which they would illegally trade with the Zanj and the Moors on the eastern coast of Africa. And because they came in as refuge seekers, they had to learn the language of their hosts, the Proto-Bantu language, but because they were far removed from the custodians, and oftentimes, when they usurped their Proto-Bantu lady or lord, the Proto-Bantu would abandon the district and leave them to their own vices. The lords and ladies were called Mwami in a lot of cases. This resulted in the new settlers learning and speaking oversimplified versions of the Proto-Bantu language and having little to no idea about the history, myths, and customs, or the meanings of the language words they were using. I hope that explains why people didn't understand that Bantu doesn't mean people, and didn't know about the Bapati or elder or Ghana younger kingdoms, which were called Vanaveni, or the people belonging to these kingdoms called themselves Wagulimo, as in Mulimo, I am of Mulimo. The people fleeing the Zanj Islamic Moorish violence and conquest sought refuge in the Proto-Bantu kingdom, which was the last bastion by 1000 CE. This wouldn't last because the Bahima, whose territory was at Mogadishu, had already fallen to the Zanj and their sultan. Once this happened, the Bapati or Elder Great Lakes Tanganyika Proto-Bantu kingdom began to weaken. They lost control of their trading posts at Malindi, Guliwa, Mombasa, and their gold mines to the Islamic expansion, and often West Central African refuge seekers looking to ally with the Islamic people on the eastern coast to control resources from within, from 10,000 CE onwards. So the influx of the West Central Nilo-Saharan African people fleeing the Islamic slave raiders and the invasion of the eastern territories resulted in the elder or Bapati kingdom to weaken, and this kingdom experienced a drastic demographic and cultural shift, or change really, having a higher presence of West African and Nilotic Kushite people, which is what we see today, and a mix. The Vanna or Ghana or Younger Kingdom, which covered the entire southern Africa, began to weaken too, with the arrival of a Zanj group that occupied and controlled the gold mines at Great Zimbabwe, or the Zimbabwe area, in about 1000 CE. This was way before the group that would become the Shona arrived. The Zanj-led group occupied this territory until the late 1300s, or the rise of Mbire, who seems to have arrived from the Swahili coast with Moorish backing. As stated before, the Islamic sects were not unified, and each sought economic gain, usually using Africans as puppet governments or substitute governments to do their bidding. This caused an ebb and flow which continued into the Wapati or elder and Ghana or younger Proto-Bantu territories, with each successful aspirant vying to gain favor with the Moors, as they now styled themselves. The Moors, who controlled the seaports to the outside world, became the only way to gain economic advantage. But it failed, because the Moors wanted gold, but weren't willing to mine it. The new African settlers in the Proto-Bantu territory often didn't know how to mine gold or refine it, and the Proto-Bantu they had just displaced just wouldn't do it. So the new African settlers often washed for gold down the rivers, and they often sold gold dust. In return, they got beads and cloth sometimes. But over time, they realized it was more beneficial to sell people, so they did. So now you have an idea of why most people were wearing animal skins and selling human beings. It's not a pretty story, many won't like it, but it begins to explain proclivities, loyalties, and why things are how they are. It needs to be told because we can't all hold ourselves to the standard of people without one in the name of one Africa. One Africa can only work with discernment because it has already been done, and the lack of discernment led to the disappearance of the ancient Proto-Bantu kingdom, which was the oldest kingdom in Africa. It may have been founded in about 3600 or 36,000 BCE really. I mean, it's a myth now to the point that most people can't believe it even existed. The only evidence that we have left is the language, because all the relics and artifacts were stolen, raided, destroyed by the new settlers, because sometimes they lacked discernment and let everyone in rather than holding up their standards. So I hope you liked this video. Please like and subscribe for more videos on African history. If you would like to support this channel, you can give to our coffee. The link is in the description box below. Thank you for watching.